My apologies. I screwed up. I actually accidentally clicked on the stop button. So this will be, I guess, kind of like with the first lecture. This will be part lecture Reformation part 2B. And hopefully I'll try to keep my fingers off of anything so I don't inadvertently stop things and need a part C or D or E to this. We're talking about the patterns of Reformation, the Radical Reformation. And Karl Stott, I had mentioned previously, Wittenberg became very radicalized in terms of moving theologically far beyond Luther, which then had practical import. He celebrated Mass, the first so called evangelical Mass in Wittenberg in 1521 in December, where he did not wear his priestly vestments. He just wore a gray cloak, portraying himself as just one of the people and giving both the bread and the wine to everyone. Now, this was a major issue. It's called communion of both kinds. Um, Luther said, yeah, theoretically it'd be fine, but it's not that big of an issue. Huss was very much for the communion of both kinds. It had been accepted for Bohemia. The church, actually, there were two sides of the Hussite movement, and one was less radical than the other. And the less radical side received the permission to give the cup to the laity as well. So it's not an absolute issue, it's a practical issue based on the theology of the elements as being actual blood and body of Christ. I see a lot about that in terms of the problems involved, because if the host and the cup chalice are consecrated, then you're not dealing just with bread and wine, you're dealing with Christ's body and blood, and what happens if you spill it. Those kinds of issues. But this idea that they're not Christ's body and blood became an increasing factor. A reformer in Zurich in Switzerland named Ulrich Zwingli, who was not part of the Radical Reformation, but he's part of the City Reformation, but he advocated a position that the word is does not mean actually physically is, but signifies or represents. And this is getting at the issue of Eucharistic theology. I'm trying not to get into the nitty gritty of it all, but there's a close relationship between Eucharistic theology, i.e., the theology of the elements of what happens in the Mass, and social structures, political structures during this time. And Zwingli became persuaded of the position that the Mass is not transubstantiated. Now, Luther didn't say that it's not transubstantiation, but for Luther, still it's consubstantiation, whereby the elements of the bread and wine become the actual physical body and blood of Christ. Luther says, I gnaw on the flesh of my Redeemer. And that gets into other issues in terms of the difference between transubstantiation, which was the position since the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and consubstantiation with Luther, because he said that the elements of the bread and wine, in, under, and with the bread and the wine, is the actual physical body of Christ that we receive through faith. He didn't have the problem, because if you don't have the faith and believe that, then it's just bread and wine. So if you drop the host, it's not that big of a deal if a rat or a mouse comes along and eats it, because they don't have the faith that makes that the true body and blood of Christ. But Zwingli was saying, and this will come back as being very important. So he said, no, it doesn't mean that at all. This is just bread and wine. It stays bread and wine. But there's a spiritual union with Jesus as we share communion within the context of our group. It's a communal understanding, okay? Very much the same way with the peasants, this idea of a communal village. This will also be called the communal Reformation, the deacon-minded Reformation. Based on, let's say, the parish level. And Zwingli went along those lines. He was not as radical as some, though. And with Karl Stott became even more radicalized. Now, this radical movement included people that said, you know what, let's look at the scripture for ourselves. We're going to be doing this now. I'm looking at the scripture, I don't see anything about baptizing babies in here. Baptism is not for babies. Baptism is initiation of adults into the Christian community. And if you have not been baptized, then you're not a Christian. And you can't be baptized as a baby because babies don't have the ability to say, I believe this. This idea of adult baptism, denying infant baptism, developed as a result of these early years of the Reformation, the course of the 1520s. Ideas started spreading around, and some came to Zwingli and said, look at this. This is what we believe. He says, no, you're wrong. But what they started doing was rebaptizing people. Now, in their minds, the minds of these we'll call Anabaptists, this is the tradition of the Baptist tradition that we still with us today. They were not rebaptizing anybody. If you were baptized as an infant, you weren't really baptized. It wasn't a valid baptism. So they were not rebaptizing, they were just baptizing for the first time. But for everyone else, it's like, oh my God. Now, this issue of baptism goes all the way back to the early church in the debates. And it was seen as blasphemous to claim that infant baptism was not valid, number one. And number two, to claim that if you had been baptized, you hadn't really been baptized. It's the issue of an early heresy called Donatism that Augustine fought against, whereby what made the sacraments effective was the moral quality of the priest. Also gets to be rather complex, but rather what Augustine argued is it has nothing to do with the moral quality of the officiant who's actually baptizing or consecrating the host and the wine, because what happens in these sacraments is something that God does. God makes these sacraments effective. And to say that then a baby can't be baptized is saying that God can't do it. So it was seen by the opponents as this is theologically not only heretical, but blasphemous. But groups of these Anabaptists, as they were called, started to spread and take off. Now, some became rather militant, and there was a group in the 1530s that tried to establish the New Jerusalem in Germany, and they were put down by everybody because if all of the various what's called the magisterial reformers, the Zwingli, Luther, and later in England, they'll get to England and France, they could agree, and then the Catholics, they could agree on anything. These Anabaptists, these radicals, should be suppressed, and they were. And it was the city of Munster. This is, of course, in the 1530s. An Anabaptist kingdom was established. It also practiced polygamy and everything else, and that was seen as horrific by everybody. A big problem with the Radical Reformation. These Anabaptists and their various guises, because we have everything from this militant approach to the Mennonites. Also, a group that are still with us today, the Mennonites. They were the pacifists. They didn't believe that we should bring about the kingdom of heaven here on earth militarily or by force, that we were passive. But they still believed in this kind of general Anabaptist thing. None of these various factions within what has been called the Radical Reformation had any political support. That is a huge difference. I remember saying that Father Frederick the Wise was the father of the Reformation because he supported Luther. Once you had these new ideas being put forward and positions, theologies, we could even say, being put forward, they fused with the political entity, which gave them legitimacy and the ability to be defended over against people who disagreed. With the Anabaptists and the Radicals, which also included a group that weren't Anabaptists, but they were called the Anti-Trinitarians, still with us today in terms of the Unitarian Church, the Unitarians. That goes all the way back to the rise of Anti-Trinitarians in the 16th century. So all of these impacts that are still with us from this Reformation period. They were seen as heretical too, by all means. You can't deny the very foundational principle, theological principle of the Christian tradition, which is the Trinity, what they were doing. Anyway, so it's a very mixed bag, but none of them were established within a political territory that could support them so that their theological positions became adopted as the religious stance of the community, of the political entity. What happens in the Reformation is political. Yes, it's theological too. And sometimes you can't break apart one from the other. But if we don't see that political side of it, the theological side could have been easily repressed. It was the political power. Frederick the Wise, as we'll see as we go further. And politically, it's often been seen that the greatest example of the political side of purely political side of Reformation is the English Reformation, which is another pattern of Reformation. This too can be a long story. Henry VIII, I mentioned as one of these new brash young monarchs of England, whom the Pope had approached as potentially being a candidate for Holy Roman Emperor after Maximilian died in 1518. But just like Francis I of France, wouldn't really work. Couldn't get the Germans to vote for an Englishman. Henry, though, was very staunchly on the Pope's side, and even with Luther being aware of what was going on in 1521, Henry wrote a defense of the Mass, in response to which the Pope deemed him the defender of the faith. That became his title, the defender of the faith. So Henry and the papacy are all one and the same. But Henry had a problem. You probably know this story or have heard of this story, at least some of it. Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, had not given him a son. Yes, I phrased it in that way because that's how Henry viewed it. It was her fault that she did not produce a son. It certainly wasn't his. He needed an heir to the throne. So what he ended up doing is wanting to get rid of Catherine, get a divorce. Pope says no. Henry says, fine, I'm proclaiming myself the head of the church, and divorces Catherine. Why? Because he was didn't want to have anything to do with her. He wanted to have a son, and he was having an affair with one of her ladies in waiting, Anne Boleyn. He wanted to marry Anne. Now that's almost puts it in terms of this is simply a matter of Henry's libido. We talk about horny Henry, but that is not really what was going on at all. Even though I'm not discounting that part of it. Okay, what was going on? Henry had come to the throne, inheriting it from his father Henry VII, who had won the throne as the first Tudor king in a bitter war called the War of the Roses. And it was over succession. Who was to succeed to the throne of England? And the Tudors, under Henry VII, won out. Henry VIII knew that if there was not a male heir, a clear heir to the throne, there could be civil war, as there had been with the War of the Roses in the later 15th century. Henry's older brother, Arthur, died before he became king. There was almost a King Arthur in England, Henry's brother. Henry's brother Arthur had been betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, making an alliance between Spain and England. Spain and England were close allies at this point. Henry thought, okay, we need to just take over my brother's widow to keep that alliance going there, so I'll marry Catherine. The problem is he needed papal dispensation to do so, to marry his brother's widow. So they petitioned the Pope, and the Pope said, of course, no problem. Clear, you can marry Catherine. This is a legitimate marriage. Well, again, the problem is Catherine gave him a daughter, Mary Tudor, but could not produce a son. Meanwhile, Henry was having this affair with Anne Boleyn, and thought, how can I get rid of Catherine so I can marry Anne? Because Anne certainly could give me a son, so we can have an heir to the throne, so that it won't be a problem in terms of succession. Well, he said, I have to ask the Pope to annul the marriage to Catherine. There's no such thing as divorce at this point, especially in the Catholic context, but you could have an annulment. So Henry petitions the Pope for an annulment. He sends a delegation to Rome, 1527, to say, King Henry needs an annulment. And what's the rationale for this annulment? Well, Catherine was his brother's widow. That's not legitimate, so he wants an annulment. This put the Pope in a very, very difficult position. Why? Well, number one, Henry had already received papal dispensation to marry Catherine, to proclaim that marriage valid. And now he was saying, no, it's not. Pope said, we already said it was. I'm not going to go back on my word there. That makes it very difficult. I mean, I wasn't the one to grant it, but my predecessor was. Blah, blah, blah. Another problem is in 1527, what was going on? In 1527, France and Germany, or the Empire, were at war. Charles V. Why didn't Charles V simply suppress Frederick the Wise and go and take Luther? Well, one major reason is he had a war with France going on at the time. He didn't really have the time to turn all of his energy and power and authority to the Luther question. He had to go fight France, whose young monarch, Francis I, was causing all kinds of problems. A series called the Habsburg-Valois Wars, which I'll be coming back to probably in the next lecture to begin. And Charles was victorious in this early phase. But it was a problem because the Pope was actually supporting Francis against Charles. Not good. I mean, after all, Charles was the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope should be supporting him, not this rebellious, in Charles's mind, King of France. King of France says, I'm as good as the Emperor. Pope says, I don't like Charles, so I'm going to support you, Francis, to get against Charles. When Charles found all this out, he sent people to deal with the problem in Rome. Armies go into Rome, 1527. What do armies do? They rape, pillage, and plunder, as they always have. And it's called the Sack of Rome of 1527. And the Pope had to flee to Castle San Angelo. Now, Catherine of Aragon was the great aunt, I believe it is. Could be a niece, but I think it's an aunt. I always forget which one. Of Charles V. Charles is looking out for his dynasty because the offspring of Henry and Catherine would unite Spain and England. Henry's wanting to get rid of Catherine, axed that whole alliance. So Charles does not want that to take place because for his family politics, the European politics, the imperial politics. Charles held more territory than anyone since Charlemagne, essentially, within the Habsburg realm. Spain, Austria, the Empire, the Lowlands. He didn't want to lose Spain. And he had been king of Spain first, if you remember. So the Pope is in hiding, but he's in no way in hell are you going to give Henry an annulment. So the Pope says, okay, no annulment. Now, it's often portrayed as, oh, there's no divorce in the Catholic Church, therefore that was a moral issue. It's like, absolutely not. Pope would grant annulments for any kind of reasons, especially if it fit his political interests. That was not the point or the problem. The problem was, number one, Charles' troops in Rome saying you can't do this because it would dissolve the alliance between England and Spain and disinherit in some ways my family from the throne of England. And number two, because the previous pope had already said this is a legal marriage. So it was a political problem all the way around. Henry's envoys come back and they say, sorry, no go. Henry's like, what? What do we do now? So he put a couple of his advisors working on the problem, and it became very acute. A number of years later, a few years later, in 1533, when Anna Boleyn became pregnant. It's like, oh my God, My mistress is now pregnant. I'm still with Catherine. I don't want to be with Catherine. I want to be with Anne. Anne's going to produce a boy. I know she's pregnant. I know she's going to produce a boy. But if it's just my mistress, it's just a bastard. It's not going to be the heir to the throne. So I have to right now somehow get rid of Catherine so I can marry Anne so her baby will be legitimate and be the heir to the throne. A couple of things. Number one, his advisors, Thomas Cranmer and Wolsey, were very influenced by some of these new ideas coming in. Okay, these Protestant ideas. They were more allied with Luther. Henry was very much against Luther, you remember. They also then found a treatise, a 14th century treatise called The Defender of the Peace by Marcellus of Padua, who argued that the papacy is simply a human construct, and that the emperor is in charge of everything. The emperor is the head of the church and the head of the state. And they were the first ones to study this, have it translated into English, and presented it to Henry as here is a traditional medieval justification for proclaiming yourself head of the English church. And there's other factors involved in terms of the history of national churches in the medieval period and granting privileges, but it was seen as now Henry's opportunity to simply dismiss the Pope, which then Henry did and got it passed through Parliament, 1534, the act of supremacy, proclaiming Henry head of the church. Simple fiat. He sends Catherine away, proclaims it annulled, marries Anne Boleyn, who gave birth to a girl who became Elizabeth I. That's a story that I'll come back to later on in the next lecture. But that's kind of that one pattern and how it all works. But another influence coming into England at this time in the early 1530s, especially as we get into the 1540s, was actually from a French theologian movement named John Calvin, which brings us to another pattern of Reformation. This is what I talked about the city Reformation and the Reformation of the refugees. The rise of cities, the first rise of cities starts really around the year 1000, where the population is increasing in Europe and more cities are established. To make a long story short, in development, there are a number of cities, both in France and in the Empire, that received from the King of France or from the Emperor their independence from their territorial overlord. They were called the Free Imperial Cities in Empire, and they were called the communes in France. These were then cities that, rather than having to answer to the local prince or duke, they answered directly to the king or to the emperor. They had a greater degree of freedom, therefore, than a lot of the other cities. So they could run their own affairs and determine their own affairs as long as they performed their services and duties and responsibilities to the emperor or the king. These free imperial cities were very important for the spread of the Reformation and were early supporters of Luther. Not 100%, but that is where some of these ideas really took off and spread. So these free imperial cities also stood up to Charles, in other words, as having a tradition of freedom of the cities. There was a slogan, city air makes free, Stadt Luft macht frei. If you're in the cities, you could control your own destiny and govern your own affairs. In Germany, also in France, these communes had the same type of ability. Now, in France, we have this new monarch, Francis I. Francis, I'm often called Charles V, the last medieval emperor, and Francis I, the first modern monarch. And I'll get back to some of that again in the next lecture. But for now, what you need to know is that Francis didn't give a hoot about doctrine. He's Catholic, obviously. The French monarch was called the most Christian king. But personally, he didn't really care. His sister, though, did. And his sister was interested in some of these new ideas and supported some of these reforming groups of humanist scholars and goes on. So there's supposed to be this influx of new ideas within France, not breaking away yet, but just based on humanist scholarship, on a reform of the church, getting rid of abuses, which was seen to be everywhere. Very few people argued that there was nothing that needed to be cleaned up in terms of the state of the church and the function and workings of the church. And in Paris, there was one of these kind of humanist circles, the University of Paris. And a young scholar by the name of Jean Calvin, or John Calvin, became a part of it. And they were arguing for the need to renew structures and reform structures. Also, in terms of some of the cities, some even more radical ideas were coming in to the point where, also in 1534, there is kind of an uprising. It's called the Affair of the Placards in October 1534. And a placard is a one-page broadsheet, not technically a Flugschrift, but it's a one-page thing. And this placard was very critical of the Mass, very critical of the papacy, not just a list of theses, but a whole list of statements and assertions about the diabolical nature of the Mass, the diabolical nature of the papacy. And so this broadsheet was printed all over and distributed all over Paris, all over France. Even one was posted on the bedroom of the king. For Francis, that was too much. Fine, I don't care what you people out there are saying or doing. I could care less. But don't you dare get to me and you know, I wake up in the morning and I find this frickin' thing here. It's repulsive. That started his crackdown. That we are going to stop this. We're going to stamp it out and not allow it in the kingdom. Since Calvin was associated with one of these circles, reform circles, he didn't author this placard that was posted all over the place, but espousing some of the same ideas, even if not nearly in the offensive manner that it did. They thought, with this new crackdown and repression of being burned, captured and burned, that's what do you do? We better get out of here. So he flees. He goes first to Basel, in Switzerland, and writes a book called The Institute of the Christian Religion. 1536 is the first edition. It would go through multiple editions thereafter. And he wrote a prefatory letter to the King of France. Calvin was French, and his heart was always in France. He felt that if only he could convince Francis of his cause, their cause, everything would be okay. Much like Luther with the Pope early on. Of course, Luther didn't have much success convincing Leo. Calvin didn't have any success convincing Francis. Also, to make a very complex series of developments very short, too bad because it's such a fun story, and make it back to some of it at some point, but not here. I need to get going. He went to Geneva. His writings got noticed, and there was an older person, Farel, in Geneva, in Switzerland, another city-state in Switzerland. And they had recently kicked out their bishop. As part of this reforming movement of these independent cities, who would say, we are declaring our freedom from the bishop, who's our overlord, our feudal overlord. We are going to say no more. And this had a lot of benefits for the city, because then what do you do with church lands? You say we are now independent of the bishop, you take those church lands. So there's an economic aspect there too for a city to turn to the Reformation, as we would say it, or to adopt evangelical principles at this point. And Geneva had already done that, and they said, we need help reforming, putting it into practice, in effect, what we've now done politically. And Farel, Guillaume Farel, was the older gentleman kind of running this, and he had read some of Calvin's pamphlets and early works in his institutes. So please, you have to stay and help. Calvin didn't really want to, but he said, okay, I will. So they're there, and they start working, and Calvin was trained as a lawyer. He was not trained as a theologian at all. He was trained as a classical scholar. His first publication was a commentary on Seneca, one of Seneca's works, De Clementia, on clemency. And he had become known as a classical scholar, and then as a legal scholar. He studied law. He had not studied theology. If we can say one thing about Calvin, it was an issue of if we were going to live our ideas to avoid persecution, to avoid scrutiny, we better put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and live as if we actually believe it. So he wanted to really put into effect a regimen of discipline and morality. And they tried to do that in Geneva in 1536 and 1537 and 1538. And by 1538, the Geneva City Council switched again. And they said, this regime is repressive. We get rid of it. And they kicked them out. They kicked them out of the city. Farel and Calvin, no more. Okay, we're free of our archbishop, our bishop, but we're not going to deal with this crap anymore. We don't want to have to, stop drinking and dancing and gambling. We like it. So, you know what? Deal with it. Well, didn't go very well. Calvin left, spat on Geneva as he left. I'm never going to go back to this godforsaken place. 1540 rolls around, and Geneva had been trying to put themselves in order and just couldn't. So they didn't go back to Farel. They had Farel, but Calvin, we could deal with Calvin. Calvin, please come back. He said, no way in hell. He went back to Basel, was working in Basel. They said, please come back to lead us. We need your guidance. He goes, no way. He said, we'll give you the bishop's palace. You can live in the bishop's palace. We'll give you a big fur coat. All these attempts to woo him back to Geneva to lead the reform effort. He said, no, 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 no. And they finally said, okay, what can we offer you? He said, well, if you accept a document like my ecclesiastical ordinances, then I will come back. I said, well, okay. So they said they would. Calvin comes back. The city council, and it's the city council's decision, passes and accepts Calvin's ecclesiastical ordinances for the organization of the church in Geneva. I'll talk more about Calvin and Calvinism as we go along, especially in the next lecture. But for now, Calvin developed a legalistic, moralistic theology based on predestination. He did so in the context of facing persecution. Now, he was safe in Geneva, but keep in mind, his eyes are always on France. And he used Geneva not only to reform Geneva, but as a place where people would go to be trained by Calvin and would be sent back into France. So he's always looking at France, trying to get Calvinism into France and go from there. And I'll talk more next lecture about his view of predestination and the distinction between Calvin and Calvinism. Because Calvinism, I think we could arguably say, had a broader impact, a more important impact on the development of the West as we move on into the later 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century than did Luther and that movement, or even than did Anglicanism with Henry, for reasons that, again, I'll be talking about next time. So here, just as a little example, though, in terms of this issue of the refugees, because Calvin has fled. That's what they were fleeing persecution, whether it be in France, whether it be in England, because they had Calvinist communities going to England that were facing persecution as well. What do we do? And my advisor was a Calvinist pastor, but not your typical one whatsoever. He didn't get this book written. I mean, he wrote a couple books on Calvin, but the one he really wanted to write, he never completed. But I know that his thesis, he was a Dutch Calvinist. He was Dutch Calvinist. His thesis was that Calvinism is a beautiful religion under the cross, under persecution. But when it becomes the established religion of a territory, as he said, as it did in 17th century Netherlands, it becomes diabolical. Think about that for a moment. That's some of the switch between Calvin and Calvinism they'll be talking about next time, the impact that this doctrine had and continues to have. It was not Calvin's view. Calvin is like, my God, we are facing being killed. How do we handle that? And knowing that we are in God's hands is the only real way for Calvin to deal with the constant threat of persecution, suppression, after having fled from your homeland. And not all people did flee. Calvin writes back to one of the leaders of the French Protestants, a term I'll still come back to, um, say you should stand up for your faith. And he's saying, screw you, Calvin. You're safe in Geneva. If we stand up for our faith here, we will be burned. What do you do? Do you hide, work undercover, underground, or do you stand up and say, no, this is wrong, when you know you'll be killed for it? That was some of the issues that we'll hear more about as we go along with the French Wars of Religion there. So those are the different aspects, um, patterns of Reformation, the Reformation of the refugees. And then we come back to the final slide, from religionization to confessionalization. And I think I started off this whole lecture, the first part, saying this in some ways, in my interpretation, what we see the difference between the Reformation and the later Middle Ages is one based on religionization, how to be more religious. We are religious. How do we make people more religious and live a more fully, complete, legitimate religious life? Whereas confessionalization is how do we enforce a particular religious confession? That gets us then back to the concept of the Protestants, first Protestants. And this is the last slide. I'll get through it as quickly as I can. First Protestants. I said earlier that Luther, originally, his movement was called the Evangelicals, based on the gospel, Evangelium. Not what we think of today as evangelicals. I'm not trying to say that there isn't that close relationship in their minds today between themselves and what the gospel actually is. But you can't think of what today is referred to as the evangelicals and say that was what Luther was at all, because he certainly was not, even though the term is the same. And I talked about the issue of the Deed of Augsburg. Excuse me, the Deed of Worms in 1521 when he's condemned, and Frederick protecting him. He goes back to Wittenberg, and Charles cannot really deal with these princes, with Frederick, or the other princes and cities who are supporting Luther, supporting this evangelical position, even if it's simply because it's not Italian. We're not going to give in to the Italians, or damn emperor, we're not going to give in to the emperor. But there's a real tension here, but Charles can't focus on it because he is fighting France. He's fighting Francis the First. Real tension and conflict there. In 1529, there's a meeting of the Reichstag. Charles is not there. So the city of Speyer, called the Deed of Speyer. And these cities and princes that were protecting Luther and supporting Luther are trying to say we should allow this to go through. We need to protect Luther, whereas the others, those supporting Charles, said no, the Edict of Worms, Charles' condemnation of Luther, the Reichstag, the imperial legislature's condemnation of Luther at Worms in 1521, has to be enforced. There was discussion going back and forth previously to this, but in 1529, kind of came to a head, and the Reichstag said, no, the Edict of Worms, the condemnation of Luther, has to be enforced. And a number of princes, including the Elector of Saxony, Frederick had died, I think it was John by this time, Elector John of Saxony, and some of the other princes and cities said, no, we protest. We are not going to enforce the Edict of Worms. We protest. And they walked out. They became known thereafter as those Protestant princes and cities, or Protestant. Namely, the origins of the Protestants is a political opposition to the emperor and the imperial legislature. That's what it was about. Before that, there's no such thing as Protestants. There's the evangelicals and then the Catholics. Now, this was a major step, 1529. It's like, oh my God, we have to get our act together. We have to then get all these evangelical cities and political entities together so we can provide a common front against the emperor, because we are now in rebellion against the emperor. So what we're going to do is make a statement of faith. We have another imperial diet, another meeting of the legislature coming up in Augsburg in 1530. We are going to present a statement of faith that will allow us to present a common front against the emperor to show him how unified we are in opposition. Philip Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man, wrote up this document and called it the Confession for Augsburg, Confessio Augustana, the Confession of Augsburg that would become the basis of the Protestant position, just as the Catholic position became those cities and principalities that would enforce the Edict of Worms. The Protestant position was those cities and principalities that accepted the Confession of Augsburg. You can still read it. It became still is one of the foundational documents of the Lutheran Church, going through all the major points, theological points of where they stood. Now, they said what we need to do is get these Swiss cities who are following this Zwingli, whom I mentioned previously. If we can get them together, we have a really good chance to stand up against Charles. Philip of Hesse, one of the major princes in the empire. Okay, I'll offer my castle at Marburg. We'll get Zwingli and Luther together. We'll work out an agreement and go from there. Which they did. They came, and Luther came, and Zwingli went, and they agree about everything. They agree about justification. They agree more or less about the problems within the church, about baptism. They agree. Zwingli agreed with infant baptism, all those kinds of things, but they could not agree on the Eucharist. Traditionally, it could be apocryphal, just a story, but it very much is getting at Luther and what he means. It was said that he had, before they even started conversations with Zwingli, he carved on the table "Hoc est corpus meo," which are the words in Latin of institution. This is my body. Put the tablecloth back over it, and when they got to the doctrine of the Eucharist, rolled it back and said, "When my Lord says, Hoc est, this is my body, Hoc est corpus meo, I believe what he says. I gnaw on the flesh of my Redeemer." And Zwingli's like, "Oh, Martin. This means is. It means signifies. It doesn't mean actual physically is." Martin says it means is. That interpretation of that one word kept Zwingli and Luther from agreeing, which kept them from being able to present a unified position. So what happened at Augsburg in 1530? The German princes and cities presented the Confession of Augsburg, and Zwingli and some of the Swiss cities and Lower German cities offered another confession, the Confession of the Four Cities, to the emperor. So there's a division there. Zwingli supposedly was in tears, saying, "Oh, Martin." And Martin's like, "No, damn it, this is the way it is. I'm not going to budge on this." That doctrine prevented that unified front against the emperor. Another theologian there, Martin Butzer, young, he became a leading moderate reformer in the empire. Said future generations are going to laugh at us because the doctrine that should unite us is dividing us. Yeah. At Augsburg, 1530, both sides presented their case, and the Diet of Augsburg still said no go. The Edict of Worms must be implemented. Charles was there in Augsburg. The evangelicals, now the Protestants, went back. Okay, now we have to prepare for war. We are in open rebellion. This is the last straw. It's coming. Charles now is sort of finished with France, at least for the time being. He's coming for us. We better organize. And they organized a defensive league called the League of Schmalkalden in 1531 to fight against the emperor. There are a series of religious wars in the empire between the Protestants and the forces of Charles. Charles is still dealing with Francis on and off. Neither side was able to exert dominance or supremacy. Both sides had some victories, both sides had some losses. For the Protestants, the whole basis was the Confession of Augsburg. They at times forcefully implemented the Reformation. That meant we're going to shove it down your throat, as they did in Hildesheim in the early 1540s. Hildesheim theoretically voted to go along with them, but it was under coercion, very clear military coercion. It only ended in 1555. I may come back to some of this too in the next lecture, because it gets at some of those important points of this transition. Charles realized it was going nowhere. He had tried to suppress the Protestants, but they had become too strong and they were growing. And now you have the issue of the Calvinists too, of Calvin influence coming in, because some cities became followers of Calvin's writings. It just says, I'm over and done with. The world has changed. And he resigned. 1555, he turned over the empire to his brother, Frederick of Austria, and he retired to a monastery. His son was King of Spain, Philip II. This is the rise of the golden age of Spain. Charles retired to a monastery, defeated. And in the Diet of Augsburg of 1555, they agreed to disagree. They came up with a compromise, a little bit later formulated as the religion of the prince would determine the religion of the territory. Cuius regio, eius religio. That's called the Peace of Augsburg, settling the civil war within the empire. This was not an issue of toleration. What it said was, if within a territory, within a political territory, if the prince, the duke or the count or the whatever, was a Protestant, everybody within the territory had to be Protestant. Catholicism was not allowed. If you were a Catholic prince, your territory would be completely Catholic. Protestantism would not be allowed. So if you were a Protestant, just Joe Blow Protestant in a Catholic territory, you had to either convert or leave. Mechanisms by the state started being put into place to ensure religious conformity based on the confession. And this is what we call confessionalization. Confessionalization is the process or processes by which a particular religious confession was inculcated within a given political territory as an instrument of territorial state building. I'll repeat that. Confessionalization was the process or processes by which a particular religious confession was inculcated within a particular geographical territory, political territory, as an instrument of territorial state building. That's a definition I want you to know, because that implies several things. Number one, religion, as it always had been, essentially, was a function of the state for the state to enforce. And they did so to a greater degree than ever previously. If all of a sudden it's an issue of the state, and if your territory is going to be all Protestant, if you're Protestant, you realize that there are a lot of Catholics in there. You start developing institutions to make sure that if you're Protestant, all Catholics are rooted out. Or if you're Catholic, that all Protestants are rooted out, down to the local level. So we have an increase in bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, to control the religio-political situation of the territory. Yeah. I'm going to come back to the French Wars of Religion in the next lecture. I have them there, but the same thing. Just as the civil wars in the empire were ending, the civil wars over religion in France were just about to begin. I'll deal with that in the next lecture, in the myth of the state. But I want to point out here, with this confessionalization, It really begins with the Confession of Augsburg, the very first one in 1530, and it continues thereafter. And with the Peace of Augsburg, it was a peace, but a short-lived one. It was not an issue of toleration or acceptance. It was a resignation that neither side could militarily assert its dominance. Yet within a given territory, there was no toleration at all. If you were the prince, you got to say what it was. And sometimes the prince might convert himself. And so that everybody else would have to convert. That's what it was about. And instruments were created and bureaucracy was created to enforce that throughout the territory. When I say the end of toleration, that's what I'm getting at. Because if you're a prince, you are in charge of your territory. And now this was within your purview to make sure that you had purity of doctrine, purity of teaching throughout your, whether it was Catholic or Protestant. And the failed Reformation and end of toleration. Reformation. Did it succeed or did it fail? Well, it succeeded in dividing the empire, and we'll see next lecture how it divided France, and we already saw earlier how it divided England, which we'll come back to again in the next state. So this is just kind of setting the stage for this next lecture, following lecture on the myth of the state. Did it convert people? Well, yes and no. They started having visitations, going out to the parishes to see what people believed. And often these visitations showed that people didn't have a greater understanding theologically or religiously after the Reformation than before. Did it change people's hearts and minds? Maybe some. It's hard to really know. But it didn't create this utopia of pure religion in any way, shape, or form. But it did lead to a purity of political, religious enforcement. That's the basis for the lack of toleration that was not there with medieval Christendom. And it was the basis for the emergence of a new myth in the West, that operating system which everybody started to understand and work by, the myth of the nation state. But that is the topic of the lecture next time. Thank you very much.